Hello, everyone. We've been already connected for a while. As Jerry mentioned, the idea of this second part is to look a little bit more into what happens at the national level within the countries. And for that, we will start very briefly with some definitions in terms of trying to understand governance. And then what is the national response to these global processes, how countries actually engage, and what are the processes that are triggered at the national level. And then we will use different analytical tools or frameworks, but actually there are plenty of them for this topic. So we will look at a few of them. And then also trying to understand, as we were discussing before, what are these other commitments that happen beyond the biodiversity related agreements or instruments, but that actually have an outcome relating to biodiversity. Something very important is to understand that everything that we share in this session is kind of a simplification or just identifying some key points or key features, but of course, we could go into much more detail under each of these issues. So I think it's quite important, as we were discussing before, understanding that both at the domestic or international levels, the issue of how all these different actors relate between them and the power relations between them is very important. The difference actually is mostly in terms of the type of actors that are involved. And also, as many have responded, in terms of what are the different responsibilities for each of them. A very important feature that you may or realize is that at the global level, we do not have a global authority. We do not have a government of the governments that actually obliges anyone to do anything. And that's actually a very key characteristic of all these global regimes, because we have a range of different governments or centers of power that actually are at the same level. They have their sovereignty, they want to protect it, and they do not want to be subordinated by the power of any other governments or states. So that's definitely something that that differentiates clearly the international and the domestic level. At the national level, we have different types of decision-making processes. Usually the enforcement of the rules and legislation that are adopted is much stronger, and the sense of authority of the government is very different to how we understand things at the global level. And I think something important as well that we will see later is that when thinking of in terms of international policy, we do have different political processes happening in parallel, and each of these have different rules, as Jerry was explaining. And the actors involved are also different. So that also creates additional complexity. Another difference is in terms also relating to that, in terms of how you see the structures that are established, the institutional arrangements, but also the overall processes within which these institutional arrangements are part of. And thinking at the global or international level, these structures are usually more horizontal because of the reasons mentioned before. No government likes being told what to do by another one, so they are usually always relating between them in terms of at the level of peers. And at the national level, that's slightly different, and usually the structures are much more vertical in comparison. And then something that was raised again in the responses is the issue of how to actually consider responsibility and the role of the stakeholders involved in it. And that goes back to how actually the compliance mechanisms, the enforcement measures are much more clearly described and regulated at the national level compared to how things happen globally. So those are some ideas. So moving on a little bit into definitions, the idea here is, well, you basically can see a number of definitions in terms of what governance actually means. And the idea here is to realize that all these topics have different approaches in terms of how you would analyze them or how you could analyze them. And depending on what is the focus or the subject matter that you are dealing with, there can be some differences. But I think in general, it's quite widely agreed that governance is the system, the structures, the rules, the norms that actually organize the way in which an organization or a government actually performs its duties. And if we look at the environmental governance level, it's actually basically a subset of that full range of governance arrangements that exist within, in our case, in this session, we are dealing with government, so it's about public policies and governance understood in that regard. So it's looking at those rules, norms, standards that actually generate a specific environmental outcome and can lead to change. It's important to note that, of course, these definitions, these concepts are also used, for example, at the private sector level, but it's not what we are looking at here. So that's why you will hear that I refer to governments most of the time. And Jerry explained how international agreements are developed. So he shared already some idea of the key steps that actually take place. And the idea here is to understand, okay, what happens nationally? I mean, a country has a representation, a delegation that is negotiating these processes, these agreements, but what happens at the national level? And I think what happens can be divided in two things. When looking at international agreements that are these legally binding instruments, all throughout, the government actually needs to defend or present their national position, and that requires a lot of coordination at the national level with all the agencies that are actually involved. And then when it comes to the point when, okay, the international community is happy about the text that they have in front of them, it's the solution that actually is acceptable to everyone, it will be very unlikely the preferred solution for any individual country. But it's important to understand that all of these processes require a certain level of compromise. So the adoption of a treaty means that everyone is okay with the text, or at least no one is unhappy about it. So that's, I think, an important point to keep in mind. And at that point, then a formal process usually is triggered at the national level in order to try to ratify the agreement if all the competent authorities are in agreement. And then the process of how that happens varies between countries. In some cases, the international agreement, depending on the subject area, it could be that needs to be adopted and will have the same hierarchy as the constitution, while in other cases it can be that it's a law that depends on the governance structure of each country. And I think on that point, when at the national level, the different individuals responsible for that analyze the implications and decide on whether a country would ratify or not an international agreement, it's very important that we think of this, that the state, if they ratify it, will be responsible for what they do, but also for what they don't do. And that's not a minor issue, because we usually think, okay, what are the things that we are doing against or in favor of an agreement? But actually, if we are not doing something we should be doing, the state would be equally responsible. So that's very important to keep in mind. And the way in which these actions or omissions will be actually considered are through the national implementation and the specific measures or actions that each government will design to fulfill the obligations that the country will have at the in front of that specific agreement or process. Great. So because of that need to actually translate these global agreements into the measures and actions that actually speak to the circumstances of each of our countries, there is usually a process that is a sort of translation that happens between what the global agreement or international agreement is telling us and what are the actions that we decide to take at the national level. And if you look at different international agreements, in some of them it's more obvious than in others, but you will realize that it's very important and usually explicitly mentioned in the text of them, in some cases in various occasions, that the parties or the member states, depending on the organization, contracting parties, they can have different names, will be responsible for establishing the measures subject to national legislation and adapted to the national circumstances. And this is something really important, and that again provides an idea of the different scale at which things happen. So when you are thinking of developing an international agreement, it's really difficult, as I said before, that it will contain everything, or it will reflect all the priorities that the almost 200 countries in the world actually have. However, usually those texts allow for what is known as the policy space for the governments to actually develop the actions that they consider more appropriate for their circumstances. And relating to that is the different ways in which all our countries are actually structured internally. So the governance structures in all the countries is different. In some cases, you have decisions made by the central government, and that applies pretty much to everyone. And the final say is at that central or national level, while in other cases, you have much more participation of subnational governments, local authorities. So, for example, as I said before, I'm from Argentina, and there, so in terms of biodiversity, for example, it's important to know that the national government can only set minimum standards or general framework type of legislation, but then the actual management of the resources happens at the subnational level, and therefore the provinces have the final say when it comes to the details of how you will actually manage natural resources. And that's not minor, because again, if we go back and link it to what Jerry was explaining, and these global processes where each of our countries is being represented, it's really important to understand that the position that is being presented there has been probably developed differently at the national level. So the participation of who would have been in those discussions to define what is the position of Kenya, Tanzania, China, or Argentina will actually different depending on the structures that we have and the administrative procedures that we have. Another important point, I think, is to understand, as we've seen so far, that what we know as policies is actually quite a broad term, but actually it involves a wide range of factors. And development of policies, as we will see in the next slide, require considering different things. And more importantly, it requires understanding how, from the public policy perspective, you will balance out different interests of all these different groups or actors that are involved. And in some cases, those interests may actually contradict each other. Then the other thing is that resources are usually as well are diverse. So the different groups have access to different sort of financial resources, but also they have different capacities in order to deal with the subject matter that may be in discussion. And given all these things, another key point that is very important when thinking of how policies are developed relates to the certain level of uncertainty that actually exists in terms of access to information. And that's why it's usually quite important, and there is an increasing emphasis in terms of trying to promote the participation of the public in decision making. And that means that otherwise, the information that the public would have to understand the implications of what they will need to do if a certain policy is adopted or not would be different. So those are some ideas. And as we said before, well, first of all, please remember to put comments or questions in the chat. So if you have any, feel free to include them throughout. Otherwise, we can discuss at the end. So as we said before, the governments, the countries need to translate those international obligations to something that speaks to them. And the way to do that is through a range of policy instruments. And in general, again, the understanding of what are the policy instruments that each country will decide to develop is quite open. So that's something that each government will define. And understanding policy instruments in the terms of what would be the mechanisms that will achieve that will help us to achieve the goal that the international agreement is requiring us, or more specifically, the different policy goals that the government decides to define for the specific country. And these policy instruments can take various forms. It can be legal or regulatory. It can also be economic or fiscal measures. It can be custom-based. So it's also another possibility. So we have obviously a wide range of different types of policy instruments that can be adopted to achieve an environmental outcome, for example. And the choices that are made can build on different things. One of them would be, okay, looking at what is the evidence saying. So we can have mostly give more priority or importance to the evidence-based and what the science is saying in terms of, for example, relating to biodiversity loss. Okay, so the science is identifying that we are in trouble, and they may provide some key areas on which we could be focusing on. But something really important, and that's not minor, is that usually the instruments or the measures that are designed speak to the specific country, to its history, to its culture, to the way in which the specific population behaves. So in reality, the selection of the policy instruments would actually happen considering all these things. Okay, what science is saying is very important, but of course we need to adapt that to the specific characteristics or features of our history, our background. So Listen is asking a question: how often is it an issue that relevant actors are not collaborating, resulting in suboptimal policies? That's a great point. And yeah, actually, I think it happens, it depends on what you mean by suboptimal policies, but of course, usually it can be, and it will be the case, that whatever policy is adopted, we will see in a minute the cycle and the different things that are considered, but are very rarely the best option. If you, for example, look at the science, okay, as we said before, the science is craving for very ambitious biodiversity goals. But on the other hand, you have also other actors that are more interested in actually continue having access to an income that they get through exploitation of, I don't know, small-scale agriculture, for example. So to what extent the government at the moment of deciding actually analyzes what are the trade-offs that they would need to make between having some biodiversity outcomes that relate to what science is communicating to us, but on the other hand, not really neglecting the needs of those local communities that actually use biodiversity and natural resources more broadly for the income that they have. So I think, what I would say there is it's key that the trade-off analysis or the cost-benefit analysis that the government does when deciding what are the different range of options before deciding on what will be the chosen policy are very important. And equally important is understanding that there is a wide range of factors that could be involved in the formulation of the policy, but also in the final choice that is made. But usually those with that are more powerful within the national context are those that may have a higher weight when a final decision is made. And that's, again, who has actually a voice and who is heard the most. Yeah, so that's usually, again, something quite relevant to consider. So looking at these different issues using one of the analytical frameworks that exist, that is called the policy cycle, I would like to share with you some ideas on what are these different steps or stages that take place. But again, understanding that this is a simplification of what happens in reality, that of course things happen in different ways in all the in each country. And something else is that these stages do not imply that they need to happen in this order. And it does not mean that all of them need to happen every time. Yeah. So looking at the policy cycle then, very similar to what we've seen at the international level. One of the main things is, okay, setting the agenda, identifying that there is a problem and that we need to do something about it. That seems fairly simple, but actually it's not. And some of the areas or questions that you may ask in that regard is, okay, what is actually perceived as a policy problem and who decides that? And then, okay, once we have a range of topics that are being discussed as potentially requiring policy action, then who are actually those that will finally set the agenda? And who are those that are excluded? And what is the role of media or of NGOs in all our countries? Probably that will be different as well. So that first step, actually, in addition to understanding a problem, that probably it could be that, okay, the problem is identified mostly through what the science is saying, and we need to do something about biodiversity loss, we need to tackle it, and we need to actually define what would be the targets that each of our countries will be willing to accept as part of the post-2020 framework. Okay, that requires that a process happens at the national level where we identify those key areas that will be our priorities, and we need to think of what would be the policy responses or solutions that our governments would be willing to provide in response. So once there is an identified issue, then it comes the moment when we need to develop the specific instrument. So it's the formulation of the policy, and then the definition in terms of, okay, when we are ready to adopt it. And in this regard, it's very important to understand that in general, once we identified an issue, there will be a range of policy options that a government can take to tackle that or to achieve that outcome. So in theory, what we should all be doing is to actually, okay, discussing not only, okay, we identify the topic, and now we need to decide based on what Listen was referring to and the response provided there is understanding what are the different alternatives, what are the different types of measures that we could need or that we could use. And then trying to analyze what are the costs and the benefits that they are derived from each of them. And what would be the responsible agencies or stakeholders for implementation, for monitoring, for enforcement, yeah? So once we identified all those alternatives, then the final step there would be, okay, deciding which one is the most appropriate to achieve the outcome we need, with the list of a cost, if we can call it that way. So, okay, now we have a specific policy instrument that was adopted. Decision was made. That was now we all need to do something about it, and it's the moment when the implementation starts. And that means again that all of us in the different roles we have in our society will probably need to do something about it. But based on how each country works, it can be, as I was saying before, that once a policy is adopted at the national level, then you need to kind of mirror the process and go to lower scales so that actually the relevant authorities can tell their population at the local or at the regional level in terms of what they need to do about it. And then it can be that the national level, for example, is the one responsible for the final, the overall monitoring and reporting in terms of progress made towards this a global agreement. But it can be the case that actually for the national government to develop a national report and send the information to the Convention on Biological Diversity, it actually needs to ask different local governments to tell them what they are doing and what has been the impact of the different measures implemented. Yeah, so that's also, again, trying to understand that these different levels interact actually all throughout. When thinking about implementation, of course, it's not only thinking of, okay, in this particular example, what are the biodiversity outcomes that we want to achieve, but also it's defining what will be the budget required, how we will allocate those resources, and as I said before, what are the subsequent measures or policies that will be that will need to be in place for the government to actually be able to implement and execute what they have decided. And then there is a final step or a stage that actually refers to evaluating the the impact of that policies that we decided to adopt at some point. And that refers to how effective these particular instruments have been in helping the government to achieve the intended outcomes or objectives that they have established. And going back to what Diego was saying in terms of trying to understand, okay, what is the actual effect or effectiveness of global agreements to tackle specific environmental issues? Well, it's, even though it's a little bit more straightforward at the national level, still trying to understand how to analyze and evaluate the effectiveness of a specific policy is usually quite complex, because again, it will depend on what are the elements that you are considering at the time. What are the impacts on whom you are deciding to actually evaluate? Are you really thinking broad and trying to understand the positive and negative effects on every single group, or maybe you are prioritizing some over others? And it can happen, hopefully, that we learn by doing, and therefore we reach a conclusion that actually specific policy has not been as effective as we thought, or it actually caused more harm than good. And in that case, the process will imply that this policy will be replaced by a different instrument. So you terminate that particular policy, and then you think of what would be, okay, the alternatives. And you go back to, again, the previous steps, trying to, okay, do we still need to do something about this? And if yes, okay, what are the alternatives? And then try to reassess and learn from the experience. And we've all heard the importance of adaptive management and really having these processes at the national level to be iterative. So we actually, it's a communication that is flowing all the time. So yeah, that's something quite important. And I thought of sharing an example, and I chose Tanzania, but this can be for any of our countries, actually. All the national reports, the national biodiversity strategies and action plans are available online, so you could go and check for your own country. But this is an idea that you can actually do the exercise yourselves to look at, okay, what are the Aichi biodiversity targets saying, and what is a country deciding to set themselves to do? So the global targets that are the Aichi biodiversity targets within the current strategic plan for biodiversity are those targets that the global community decided to set to do, yeah, at the global level, so the international community as a whole. But as we said before, each of these instruments then are translated to the national circumstances, meaning our national priorities, our resources, our capacities. And here it's quite clear. You can actually see, even without going into much detail, but just looking at how the words and the percentages and things have been changed. So we have, for example, target 7 from the global framework that says that by 2020, areas under agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry are managed sustainably, ensuring conservation of biodiversity. And then in the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan from Tanzania, they decided to change a little bit the weight of these elements. Yeah, and they actually decided to include some specific types of instruments that you may think then come to help us to regulate on how we will achieve this target. And same with target 11, that at the global level, it actually provides very clear percentages for the international community to achieve. And that means 70% for terrestrial and inland water areas and 10% for coastal and marine areas. That means in terms of protection. And Tanzania decided to frame it in terms of how much they will increase the areas that they have already set, and particularly focusing on marine areas. So that gives an indication of actually how a country is using the policy space that they have to actually translate the global framework into the national circumstances. So going to the chat again. So now I would like if you share, please, with all of us, if you know the national focal point in your country for at least one multilateral environmental agreement. And if you do, please tell us which MEA. So responses in the chat. Do you know the national focal point in your country for at least one international environmental agreement? And if the response is yes, please share with us who. Good, some responses are coming in. Okay, so there are some that yes, some of you know, and others not necessarily. Good. Okay, good. So that's good to actually know, because the reason why I decided to ask this question is because, of course, one way for you to be engaging in the national processes and really connected to what is happening at the global level is through the national focal point that each country has for the different agreements. And it can happen, and that's usually quite common. Jerry was explaining what are the institutional arrangements for a specific convention. So if we think of the Convention on Biological Diversity, he referred to SABSTA. And he also mentioned the Conference of the Parties, that is the decision-making body. And it could be that a country decides to designate a different person or a different agency to be the national focal point for that specific body. So it can happen that the same person or the same agency is the national focal point for the international agreement as a whole, but it can also be that different individuals will be responsible for different parts or areas within that convention. And the national focal point basically is the intermediary person between the global process and the national, yeah? And it will be the person that actually shares with us the information that comes from the global level. And then in many cases, if you, for example, in some of these processes, at some point, they require to nominate experts to be part of a specific expert group or similar or working group, and that would happen again through the national focal point. So that's quite important, that you know which agency has that responsibility, but also if you know the individuals that are actually the persons fulfilling this role, it will help you to be connected to these global processes slightly more. And now very briefly, going to the final few slides, is actually looking at, as we were saying before, the biodiversity commitments that governments make, but which go beyond those that they make in biodiversity fora. And a way of looking at that is understanding this in terms of what is called the regime complex, and that's relating to the discussions that we had before. And I know that some of you had said you had worked on UNFCCC before, so you may see, you may find this familiar, but actually it's understanding all the norms, all the rules, and all the processes and procedures that gather a certain group of actors within a specific topic or issue area. And usually there are a range of legal instruments that are established in different international organizations to actually regulate a specific subject matter. And each of these will have different actors. And this is important because, first of all, it gives us the idea of who are all the agencies that at the national level are working in terms of climate change or biodiversity, but also it means that there will be very likely national processes or institutional arrangements established to actually respond to those global demands. And it can be that different ministries will have overlapping mandates, and then the issue of trade-offs comes up quite strongly, and how they coordinate and collaborate between them will be very important. So we have different competencies of different national agencies, and the purpose and the focus of the interventions they develop will be different. And unless there is cooperation and collaboration, we can have a series of incoherent and really even contradicting set of policies at the national level. And it's also important to understand that, as we said, that at the global level, there are different actors and stakeholders involved in each of these agreements or organizations. At the national level, it's the same thing. So the stakeholders or the constituencies of the Ministry of Agriculture are obviously very different from those of the Ministry of Environment. And that's why it's really important to actually understand those differences.